In the thick Louisiana night of 1871, a young seamstress locked her door, lit her lamp, and prepared to testify against 17 powerful men. By morning, she was gone. Her supper sat cold. Her shoes rested neatly by the bed. But the ledger she guarded, the one listing names, sins, and blood money, had vanished with her. Some doors locked from the inside for a reason, and some truths refused to stay buried. The Mississippi River moved like a dark serpent that summer, slow and unforgiving, carrying secrets southward toward the Gulf. In the pre-dawn hush of July 1871, the parish courthouse at Point Verdun stood waiting on its low yellow brick rise. Its iron clock tower, the tallest thing for miles, had not yet begun to chime the hour of 7. Inside that courthouse, a grand jury was scheduled to hear testimony that could tear open the fragile skin of Reconstruction Louisiana. But the star witness never arrived. Her name was Deline Basau. 24 years old. A seamstress. A quiet soul who mended fine dresses for the wives of cotton factors and brought communion to the dying. When the bailiff climbed the narrow stairs of Celeste Arsenault's boarding house on Rue St. Louis, he found her door bolted from the inside. The key still rested in the lock on her side. A single oil lamp still glowed weakly on the table, its reservoir nearly dry, proof it had burned long past midnight. Her supper lay untouched, the bread gone stale, the coffee cold and filmed. Her shoes, plain, well-kept, the ones she wore to walk the levee on Sundays, stood neatly side by side beside the narrow bed. Nothing was overturned. No sign of struggle. Only absence. What the official report omitted, and what the parish register would bury for nearly 60 years, was that 3 other scheduled witnesses had also disappeared by the end of that week. The river bank below the courthouse was dragged in silence. The judge adjourned the trial indefinitely. And somewhere in the shadows of that yellow brick courthouse, a ledger containing the names of 17 men and the prices they had paid to make people disappear had become the most dangerous object in the entire parish. This is not merely a story of a missing woman. It is a story of divine scales, of sins written in ink and blood, of one ordinary soul who chose to stand in the light when every power around her demanded silence. It is the record of what men will do when they believe no one is watching, and what one woman did when she realized the only weapon left to her was the truth. Subscribe now and keep the lamp burning. Hit the bell. Drop in the comments the city or state where you're listening from. These stories feel heavier when we carry them together. Now lean in closer. Because what happened in Point Verdun in 1871 was never just a disappearance. It was a haunting. To understand Deline Basau, you must first understand the land that claimed her. Point Verdun sat on a treacherous horseshoe bend of the Mississippi, 40 miles downriver from Baton Rouge. In August the air was so thick with humidity and the sweetrot smell of cut sugarcane that men swore you could chew it. Cypress knees rose from black water like the fingers of drowned men. Mosquitoes rose in clouds so dense they left bloody welts on horses. The roads were ruts of black mud after rain and choking gray dust in the dry spell, dust that settled on everything: coach shoulders, windowsills, the white linen the washerwomen hung behind the shacks on the south end of town. The town had been born in the 1760s when French colonists drifted south from the Illinois country. By 1871 it was an uneasy stew, old Creole families clinging to their fading grandeur, freed black laborers who stayed on the plantations out of necessity, Cajun farmers from the interior, Irish dockhands fresh from New Orleans, and sharp-eyed northern agents sniffing for cotton profits. 6 years after Appomattox, the parish was still bleeding from the war. A small federal garrison of 12 soldiers occupied a requisitioned warehouse near the steamer landing. A Republican sheriff, a heavy, limping veteran of Shiloh, was hated by the old families. 3 newspapers printed in the careful, coded language of the Reconstruction South, one side reminding readers of what had been lost, the other whispering that it might yet return. Beneath the surface ran something quieter and more danger. The rearrangement of money and power. The old planter fortunes had been gutted by war and emancipation. New fortunes were rising, built on the same dark arts the old ones had practiced, only now they required 2 sets of books, one for the banks, one for the things that could never see daylight. Deline was not from Point Verdun. She had arrived in 1867 from the deeper bayou country, brought by her aunt Celeste Arsenault, a widow who ran the strictest boarding house for respectable young working women in town. Celeste's rules were simple and ironclad. The parlor clock never ran slow, the front door was bolted at 9, no gentleman callers passed the hallway. Appearances were not vanity to Celeste, they were armor. Deline was slender, with the dark hair of her mother's Creole people and the pale gray Norman eyes of a grandfather she had never known. Those eyes had a habit of listening, half-lowered, still, attentive. People mistook it for shyness. It was not. It was watchfulness. She took in sewing and, by spring of 1871, her clientele included the wives of cotton merchants, the parish judge's daughters, and prominent women from the Catholic Charity Society. Her hands were quick and precise. Her mouth stayed closed. In a town where gossip was currency, Deline was known for keeping her own counsel. She was devout in a quiet, almost private way, attending 6 o'clock Mass in the small brick church behind the courthouse, bringing communion to an elderly neighbor too frail to walk. She had one suitor, Etienne Pelletier, a soft-spoken bookkeeper at the cotton warehouse. He had asked for her hand twice. She had gently refused both times, yet still walked with him along the levee on Sunday afternoons. Pelletier was patient. He told a friend he would ask once a year for as long as it took. He believed not yet did not mean never. Nothing in her outward life should have marked her for violence. And that was precisely why they chose her. The ledger had never been meant for her hands. It had belonged to Marius Robichaud, a cotton broker of middling public reputation and considerable private wealth. He died in February 1871. The parish physician called it sudden apoplexy. Servants whispered of something closer to violent, panicked poisoning, a man clawing at his own throat in the night, eyes wide with terror. Robichaud had kept 2 sets of books his entire adult life. The first, found openly on his desk the morning after his death, recorded ordinary commerce, bales bought, shipments to New Orleans, notes owed to Baton Rouge banks. The second ledger was different. It had begun during the war, when chaos created opportunity. Displaced people. Lost property. Disputed titles. Men willing to handle such matters without paperwork found steady, dark profit. By the time Robichaud died, that second ledger stretched across 183 pages. It named 17 men of Point Verdun. It recorded the sums they had paid for intimidation of witnesses, quiet disposal of documents, and the permanent removal of inconvenient people. The first ledger was public. The second was not. 3 weeks after her husband's death, his frightened widow Meline found the second ledger wrapped in oilcloth beneath a loose floorboard. She sat with it for 2 terrible nights. Then, in a plain black shawl at dusk, she carried it in a sewing basket to her cousin Celeste Arsino's boarding house. She drank cup after cup of cold coffee in Celeste's kitchen without speaking. Finally she pushed the basket across the table and said only, "I cannot sleep with this in my house. You will understand when you open it. Forgive me for bringing it." Celeste waited until Meline had gone. Then, by the light of a single candle, she read the first 3 pages. Her hands trembled. She rewrapped the ledger, climbed the stairs, and hid it in the cedar-lined linen chest at the foot of Deline's bed, the only room in the house with a working bolt on the door. She told no one what it contained. Not even Deline. Or so she later claimed. The events that dragged Deline into the fire began in April. A black laborer named Isaac Green was found dead at the foot of the levee. 40 years old. A widower. A father. A man who had begun filing claims for wages owed since before emancipation. He had visited federal agents in Baton Rouge twice that winter, carrying carefully written statements. The parish ruled it a drowning. Pockets empty. Boots missing. Skull injury consistent with a fall against rocks. 2 co-workers came forward. They said Green had been beaten behind the cotton warehouse and thrown into the river. They named the foreman, Jonas Pear, a man closely tied to Marius Robichaud. In any other year, that would have been the end of it. But 1871 was not an ordinary year. A federal circuit judge named Horace Tremont, a former Union colonel, a New England Congregationalist with unshakable conviction, had been sent to enforce civil rights in the lower Mississippi districts. He did not shout. He did not grandstand. He simply issued subpoenas with the patient precision of a man carving stone with a penknife. He wanted the pattern. He had heard rumors of Robichaud's second ledger. He subpoenaed anyone connected to the dead broker. When the federal marshal knocked on Celeste's door in the hot June drizzle, Celeste, burning with fever and terror, pointed down the hallway and said her niece was the one who could speak to what was kept in the linen chest. That was how a 24-year-old seamstress with no parents and no brothers became the one soul in Point Verdun capable of putting 17 names on the public record. She had read the ledger by then. Against her aunt's silent wishes, Deline had sat night after night in her locked room, oil lamp burning, shutters closed. She listened to the house settling around her, the creak of the staircase, the distant tick of the parlor clock, the lonely bark of dogs along the levee. She read all 183 pages in 7 nights. On the first night she read only the opening pages, then set it down and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling as if the names themselves might crawl across it. On the second night she read for 3 hours, then went downstairs for tea. Celeste stood in the kitchen doorway. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. Deline carried her tea back upstairs. The silence between them was heavier than any words. By the 5th night she saw the patterns. By the 6th she knew the names. And on the 7th night, the night before she was to testify, she made her choice. She would not look away. Outside her window that final night, the Mississippi flowed on, indifferent. Somewhere in the cypress swamps, something ancient and watchful seemed to stir. In the moral universe of 1871 Louisiana, some sins cry out from the ground. Some ledgers are heavier than stone. Some women, born ordinary, find themselves standing at the threshold between silence and reckoning. Deline Basau chose the light. And then she vanished. What happened in the locked room between the lighting of that lamp and the coming of morning remains one of the most haunting mysteries of the Reconstruction South. A mystery soaked in guilt, divine justice, and the long shadow of unrepented sin. But this is only the beginning. The river still holds its secrets. And some truths refuse to stay drowned. The 7th night changed everything. When Deline Basau finally closed the ledger on the evening of July 3, 1871, the weight of what she now carried settled upon her like the heavy hand of judgment. She was no longer just a seamstress. She had become the most dangerous woman in Point Verdun, perhaps in the entire parish. 17 names. 17 men. Merchants, planters, foremen, and pillars of what passed for respectable society. Each entry a transaction in blood, fear, or erased lives. And yet, for now, most of them still did not know her name. She did not sleep. Instead, she sat in the old wooden chair by the window, shutters tightly closed, the oil lamp flickering low on its last reserves. Through the narrow slats, she watched the faint gray seam of dawn creep over the Mississippi. The river sounded different that morning, slower, almost deliberate, like it was listening. Her mind drifted back across the years. She remembered her mother, taken by the fever in the autumn of 1858 when Deline was only 11. Long nights by candlelight learning to sew, the steady rhythm of needle through cloth. On her final night, her mother had clutched her small hand and whispered, "The one thing no one can ever steal from you, child, is the careful attention of your own mind. Guard it. Use it." She thought of her father, lost at Shiloh, his face now blurred by time but his deep voice still clear, speaking French at home, English only when the world demanded it. She recalled Sunday walks along the levee with Etienne Pelletier, his patient hope, his soft brown beard catching the light. The quiet comfort of 6 o'clock Mass in the little brick church. The gentle weight of the communion tray as she carried it to her elderly neighbor. All of it felt suddenly fragile. None of it would shield her. The men in that ledger had already proven they did not hesitate. They had beaten Isaac Green and thrown him into the river. They had burned cabins with children inside. They had silenced midwives and weighted bodies with stones. Hesitation was a luxury they had never afforded. Yet as the gray light grew stronger, Deline realized something that surprised her. She was not afraid. It was something colder. Deeper. A profound stillness, the quiet certainty of a soul that has already made its decision before the mind fully names it. She had chosen. And in choosing truth, she had stepped beyond the reach of ordinary fear. The deposition was scheduled for the morning of July 5. Federal Marshal Henry Callahan arrived at dawn in a light summer rain, the kind that carries the scent of wet cypress and iron-rich earth. He climbed the stairs of Celeste Arsino's boarding house with heavy, deliberate steps. When he reached Deline's door, he found it locked from the inside. Celeste, pale and trembling, produced her master key, a thin brass one she had worn on a black ribbon around her neck for decades. The two of them stood together in the doorway and stared into the room. What they saw would haunt Point Verdun for generations. The narrow bed had been slept in. The coverlid was turned back at the corner, the pillow still held the shallow impression of a head. Her supper sat on the small pine table, rice and red beans, a piece of bread broken neatly in half, a pewter cup of water still full. All of it stone cold and untouched. Her black leather walking boots, the ones she wore to mass, stood perfectly side by side at the foot of the bed, as if she had prepared to put them on, then decided against it. The green dress she had carefully pressed the afternoon before hung on the back of the door, lavender sprig still tucked in the breast pocket, sleeves smoothed, collar sharp. Her Bible lay open on the dresser, face down on the Book of Judith, the story of the widow who beheaded the tyrant Holofernes to save her people. A single sheet of paper rested in the center of the blotter in Deline's precise, schoolmistress hand. "I will not take another name." Below it, 3 initials no one in the room recognized. The linen chest at the foot of the bed stood open. The ledger was gone. And so was Deline. No window broken. Shutters locked from the inside with the iron pin dropped firmly through the latch. The heavy bolt on the door, stiff with age and famously loud, had been thrown from within. That bolt could be heard 2 rooms away. No floorboard pried up. No ceiling disturbed. The only possible exit was the door she could not have locked behind her. Yet the room was empty. Marshal Callahan, a tall gaunt Irishman who had fought with the Irish Brigade at Antietam, stood motionless in the doorway for nearly a full minute. His long graying beard framed a face carved by war. A scar ran from his hairline down into his beard. He rubbed it slowly with the side of his thumb, a habit when thinking. He asked Celeste if she was certain Deline had been in the room when she retired. Celeste's voice sounded distant, as if coming from another room. She had brought chicory coffee at 9. They spoke for perhaps 15 minutes. Deline had been calm but pale. She said she had made her peace with God and with the testimony she must give. Celeste heard the stiff bolt slide shut after her, that unmistakable sound. The house had remained quiet all night. No footsteps on the stairs. Callahan moved through the room like a man walking through a dream. He looked under the bed. Tested the shutters. Stood on a chair to examine the ceiling. Lifted the Bible, then gently replaced it exactly as he found it, open to Judith. He asked Celeste to leave him alone in the room. From the hallway, she heard him open and close the linen chest. Then, very softly, he murmured something in Irish, a low, reverent sound. A prayer, she later believed. When he emerged, his face was the color of tallow. "This," he said quietly, "is no longer a matter for the marshal's office. This belongs to Judge Tremont." That same night, the pattern of silence began in earnest. Marcus Freeman, one of the 2 black witnesses who had described Isaac Green's beating, was last seen leaving a riverfront tavern around 10 o'clock. He walked north along the levee path with a friend, then vanished into the rain and darkness. He never reached home. His wife Cora waited all night with a lantern burning in the window. At first light she searched the path with her cousin, calling his name into the cypress silence. They found only soft black mud. Later, one of his shoes was discovered half sunk at the river's edge, laces still neatly tied. No body was ever recovered. The second witness, a white shopkeeper named Edward Lomé who had done business with Marius Robichaud, simply failed to open his store the next morning. His 14-year-old clerk found the front door locked, the till untouched, and a half-drunk cup of tea still on the counter. Lomé's hat and coat hung on their hooks. His horse remained in the stable. The rear door was bolted from the inside exactly like Deline's. The boy later said he had the unshakable feeling that someone had been there only minutes earlier. Someone careful. Patient. Unhurried. By Friday, Judge Horace Tremont had lost 3 of his 4 key witnesses. By Saturday, the grand jury was dismissed. By the following Tuesday, parish authorities officially declared that Robichaud's second ledger had never existed. The machinery of forgetting had begun its work. But the story did not end there. Decades later, in the years after the First World War, a young woman named Antoinette Duval arrived in Pointe Verdun from New Orleans. She had come to settle the estate of a childless aunt, a daughter of Celeste Arzino. The old boarding house on Rue St. Louis had passed down to her. It had stood shuttered for 2 years, thick with dust and the faint smell of mice and forgotten coffee grounds. Antoinette was 26, slender, with her grandmother's pale gray eyes and her mother's dark hair. A schoolteacher engaged to a printer she met at a suffrage lecture in Chicago. She planned to stay only a month. In the attic, inside a locked tin trunk unopened for 40 years, she found a bundle of papers tied with black ribbon. Among them was a letter sealed in wax, addressed in careful handwriting. To the one who asks. She sat on the dusty attic floor as amber light slanted through the small round window. For nearly 5 minutes she turned the envelope in her hands before breaking the seal. The letter was dated July 3, 1871, 2 days before Deline vanished. 7 pages, written in French. It began methodically, like household accounts. How the ledger had come into the house. How she had read it despite her aunt's wishes. Then, without drama or hysteria, Deline named 6 of the 17 men. She recorded what each had paid, when, and for what specific evil. The dock worker waded and sunk in the river in 1866. The freedman family whose cabin was burned in 1868, killing a 4-year-old child. The young midwife silenced in 1869, staged elopement, forged letter, shallow grave in a cane field 12 miles north. Each account was written with clerk-like precision. Deline understood that emotion would be dismissed. Cold facts might survive. Then the tone shifted on the final 2 pages. She described a visitor who came at dusk on July 1, 4 days before her deposition. The eldest son of one of the named men. Well-dressed, calm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who expected no refusal. He sat in the parlor by the fireplace and made her an offer on behalf of unnamed persons. The letter ends mid-sentence. What happened next remains unknown. In the quiet streets of Pointe Verdun today, the old yellow brick courthouse still stands. On still nights, some say you can hear the clock tower chime not from above, but rising up from somewhere beneath the river, a slow, iron note that sounds like judgment deferred but never forgotten. Deline Basau chose the light. She chose to be remembered not as a frightened seamstress, but as a woman who refused to look away from evil. In the tradition of Judith, she took up the only weapon available to her, truth. Some believe she was taken by men who feared exposure. Others whisper that in that locked room, between the lighting of the lamp and the coming of dawn, something older and more terrible than human hands came for her, a divine reckoning, or perhaps the land itself claiming its witness. The river still flows. The cypress still stands sentinel. And somewhere, the ledger and the woman who guarded it wait for the day when all hidden things are brought into the light. The parlor clock in Celeste Arzino's boarding house struck 11 on the evening of July 1, 1871, when Deline Basau made the decision that would cost her everything. The man sitting across from her in the high-backed chair by the cold fireplace had spoken with the calm precision of someone who arranged unpleasant realities for a living. He was the eldest son of one of the 17 names in the ledger, a planter rebuilding his family's fortune through cotton. 35 years old, clean-shaven, dressed in a fine dark gray frock coat cut in the latest New Orleans style. A gold ring glinted on his smallest finger. His hands showed no calluses, no evidence of honest labor. He offered her $2,000 in gold coin. Passage on a steamer to any city she chose, east or west. Letters of introduction to respectable families who would receive her as a gentlewoman of reduced circumstances. He even named them. One was the Boston family of a bride for whom Deline had sewn a wedding gown only 4 months earlier. In exchange, she was to hand over the ledger, withdraw her testimony on grounds of conscience, and leave the parish within 48 hours. He phrased the alternative with delicate menace. The parish had already shown what happened to those who carried burdens that did not belong to them. He wanted her to understand this was a kindness, the last kindness she would be offered. Then he waited. Not with anger. Not with crude threats. He waited with the patient, administrative certainty of a man who would foreclose on a farm or erase a life with the same quiet efficiency. Deline studied him for a long time in the dim lamplight. In that silence she felt, for the first time in her adult life, the crushing weight of what it meant to be a young, unmarried, unconnected woman in Reconstruction, Louisiana. A woman who had dared to read the names. She understood something deeper. These 17 men were not merely a conspiracy of criminals. They were a system. Older than any of them. It would outlive them all. Whether she fled with gold or stayed to testify, the system would remain untouched. Her voice alone could not dismantle it. She thought briefly, with a strange distant amusement, how she might describe this moment to Etienne Pelletier if she could ever tell anyone. Then she realized she never could. That inability itself felt like a small, cold wound. Finally, she asked him one question: "Who sent you?" He smiled slightly and answered that no one had sent him. He had come alone because the other 16 were prepared to take measures he found distasteful. He had wished to spare both her and himself that unpleasantness. If she had not gone by the night of the 4th, the others would come. She would not survive what they would do. Deline thanked him for the warning. She asked him to leave. He did. After the front door closed behind him, she sat alone in the parlor for nearly an hour as the clock tower outside tolled across the dark river. In that heavy stillness she realized she had not been offered a choice between life and death, but between two different kinds of disappearance. Take the gold and disappear as a person who once mattered. Stay and disappear as a body. Or choose the third path, the one she began planning while the iron clock struck 11, and disappear as something else entirely. She wrote it all down that same night. The letter, dated July 3, 1871, was composed in careful French over 7 pages. It was not a cry of fear or outrage. It read like household accounts, precise, methodical, the work of a woman who understood that emotion would be dismissed as hysteria. Only cold facts had any chance of surviving. She described how the ledger entered the house. How she had read every page despite her aunt's wishes. She named 6 of the 17 men and recorded their transactions in detail. The weighted body sunk in the river in 1866, the Friedman family burned out of their cabin in 1868 with a 4-year-old child dying of smoke inhalation, the young midwife silenced with a staged elopement in a shallow grave in a cane field. Then the tone shifted on the final pages as she described the visitor and his offer. The letter was addressed simply, to the one who asks. It ended with her signature, the date, and a note that she wrote it in case the worst came to pass so that someone, someday, would know what she had chosen and why. Decades later, in the dusty amber light of an attic in 1919, Antoinette Duval held that letter in her hands. 26 years old, with the same pale gray eyes that had once belonged to Deline. A schoolteacher from New Orleans, engaged to a Chicago printer, steeped in the suffrage movement. She had come to settle her great-aunt Celeste's estate and found the letter inside a locked tin trunk. She sat on the attic floor for nearly 5 minutes turning the envelope before breaking the seal. She read it 3 times over the next 3 days. On the 4th morning she walked to the parish courthouse carrying the letter in her handbag. The clerk denied any grand jury had ever convened in July 1871. When Antoinette produced a reference from Judge Horace Tremont's published memoir, the clerk fetched the parish attorney, a thin, careful man in his 60s whose family name appeared among the 6 Deline had listed in her letter. He was courteous. He offered coffee. He listened without asking to see the letter. Then, in the gentle tone of a man explaining why a rotten house cannot be saved, he told her the courthouse records had burned in 1884, the memoir was unreliable, and no record existed of any such young woman. He suggested, kindly, that perhaps her cousin had simply run away with a man and started a new life, as young women sometimes did. It would be best for the family's memory to let the matter rest. His handshake was dry and cool. On the bright October street outside, Antoinette understood 2 things with perfect clarity. The parish attorney had known her cousin's name before she spoke it. The letter in her handbag was now the most dangerous object in Point Verdun, just as the ledger had been 48 years earlier. She took a different route back to the boarding house. She packed her trunk that afternoon and left on the first train the next morning. She never returned to Louisiana again. The letter traveled with her to Chicago. In 1922 she married the printer. They raised 2 daughters. The letter waited 40 more years inside a safe deposit box on Dearborn Street. She told her husband about it only once, on a snowy winter evening in 1931 while the radio played news of the Scopes trial. He listened in silence and said the letter belonged to history, but the right historian did not yet exist, and the country was not ready. It was her younger daughter, Rose, who finally acted. In 1963, after reading a magazine article about missing witnesses in Reconstruction, Louisiana, Rose contacted a young assistant professor at Tulane named James Hodges. He was 31, the son of a Methodist minister, and had been searching for a case like this without knowing it. He flew to Chicago within a week. In Rose's kitchen he read Deline's letter twice while his coffee went cold. Then he asked if any other papers remained from the estate. They went to the basement together and pried open an old trunk. Beneath folded quilts and tax receipts from the 1890s lay Marius Robichaud's second ledger, exactly 183 pages, exactly as Deline had described. Hodges sat on the concrete floor and read for 2 hours without speaking. The furnace clicked. A neighbor's dog barked. Rose brought fresh coffee, he barely noticed. When he finally looked up, his voice was almost apologetic. The men named in the ledger were long dead. No prosecutions were possible. What they held was not evidence for a courtroom, it was history. And in America, history was sometimes the only justice the dead ever received. But the ledger contained one final entry that changed everything. It had been written after Robichaud's death, in a hand that matched transcriptions made years earlier by a man who had signed official contracts with a distinctive flourished P. The entry was dated July 2, 1871, 3 days before Deline was to testify. In translation from the broker's commercial French it read: Commission, 17 subscribers. Pro rata for final arrangement of the matter of the Rue St. Louis to be completed on the night of the 4th, sums collected and held in escrow pending confirmation. Only one man in the parish, besides Robichaud, knew every subscriber by name and the exact amount each would pay for such a commission, the senior clerk at the cotton warehouse. A bookkeeper with a soft brown beard and eyes squinted from years over ledgers. The patient suitor who had asked Deline Basau to marry him twice. The man who walked with her along the levee on Sunday afternoons. Etienne Pelletier. Deline had discovered his handwriting early in her reading of the ledger. She recognized the small flourished P. She had continued walking with him for 2 more weeks, testing him gently, wanting to be certain. On the last Sunday, June 25, she casually mentioned a name from page 61, a man who had purchased an arson in 1868. She watched the half-second it took him to compose his face. She knew. Yet she still took his arm on the walk home. She felt the familiar warmth through his coat sleeve and understood the worst part: he was not purely cold. In his own compromised way, he had come to care for her. He believed he deserved her. That belief made him unpredictable. After the planter's visit on July 1, Deline went directly to Federal Marshal Henry Callahan's house on the far side of the courthouse square. She told him about the offer and the threat. What happened next, between that conversation and the locked room on the night of July 4, remains one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries of the Reconstruction-era. Some truths are too heavy for this world. Deline Basau understood that the ledger was never just ink on paper. It was a record of unrepented sin, of blood money paid in the sight of God. She had chosen to stand like Judith before the tyrant, not with a sword, but with truth. In the end, she may have been betrayed by the one man she had almost trusted. Or perhaps, in that final night, something more mysterious occurred in the locked room. A disappearance that transcended human hands. A divine mercy. Or a divine judgment that took her beyond the reach of the system she could not defeat in life. The river still flows past Point Verdun. The cypress still rise like silent witnesses. The yellow brick courthouse clock tower still chimes across the water on quiet nights, a sound that seems to rise from beneath the world rather than above it. Deline chose not to disappear as a broken woman or a silenced body. She chose to disappear as a witness whose voice still echoes more than 150 years later. And somewhere, the ledger and the woman who guarded it wait for the final accounting when no door can remain locked, and every hidden thing is brought into the light. On the night of July 4, 1871, the Mississippi lay heavy and black under a low, starless sky. The air smelled of river mud, distant rain, and the faint sweetness of rotting cane. In the boarding house on Rue St. Louis, Deline Basau had already made her final preparations. She had gone to Federal Marshal Henry Callahan 3 days earlier with a desperate but precise request: help her disappear in a way more useful than her death. Callahan, a battle-hardened Irish widower who had seen too many good causes drowned in Southern blood, listened in his small kitchen as the clock ticked. He asked hard questions. She answered with the calm clarity of a woman who had read 183 pages of damnation and chosen her path anyway. She told him the ledger would vanish from any evidence room within 48 hours. The system was older, more patient, and colder than Judge Tremont could imagine. If she took the gold and fled, they would let her live 2 years, maybe 3, then arrange an accident in Boston or Cincinnati. A living witness was too dangerous. What she wanted was simple and profound: for the ledger to survive, for the 17 men to believe they had one, and for her to live quietly somewhere far from Louisiana. Above all, she wanted to leave behind an account that someone, someday, would read. Callahan sat in silence for a long time. Then, in a low voice, he said it could be done. Over the next 3 days they used every resource he had, including most of his savings meant for retirement back to Massachusetts. They secured passage for her on a cotton steamer bound for Cincinnati under the identity of a woman from Natchez who had died of yellow fever 2 years earlier. Her papers had been quietly preserved in the marshal's files. They staged the room with care: supper left cold on the table, oil lamp burning low, shoes placed neatly beside the bed, green dress pressed and hanging, Bible open to the Book of Judith. The heavy bolt on the door was locked from the inside using a trick Callahan had learned years earlier from a New York burglar: a length of fine copper wire and a patient hand that left no trace. The room was made to look like a woman had simply vanished between midnight and dawn. A lockroom mystery that would haunt the parish and make the 17 men believe their work was complete. Deline placed final instructions with her Aunt Celeste. The ledger would go into the cedar-lined linen chest, then eventually into the locked tin trunk in the attic, to wait until the world was ready to read it. She wrote her letter to the one who asks. She signed her real name for the last time. Then she slipped out into the Louisiana night, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back, a small amount of money, and the quiet fire of a soul that had refused erasure. That same night, 3 men entered the boarding house through the back garden. They used a key given to them by Etienne Pelletier, the warehouse clerk. They climbed the stairs in stocking feet, moving like shadows. They expected to find a frightened young seamstress. They found a bolted door and a silence that felt wrong. They knocked softly, 3 times in the pattern Pelletier said she would recognize. No answer. They knocked again, louder, using the edge of a pistol. Still nothing. So they did what they had come to do. A single muffled shot blew the bolt off the door. They entered. The room was exactly as arranged: cold supper, burning lamp, shoes by the bed, Bible open to Judith, and on the desk a single sheet of paper that read, "I will not take another name." The 3 men stood in the lamplight, breathing the faint scent of lavender and cooling wick. Slowly the truth settled over them. No body. No ledger. Something had gone terribly wrong in a way their power could not explain. 2 left by the back garden. The 3rd stayed behind. Etienne Pelletier sat down in the wooden chair by the window. He picked up the note, read it again, folded it twice, and slipped it into his coat pocket. He remained there for a long time in the dark as the lamp finally guttered out. He understood before the others. He had known Deline better than any of them had allowed themselves to know her. She had seen through him from the moment she recognized his handwriting in the ledger. She had continued their Sunday walks even after she knew, testing him, confirming the depth of his betrayal. And in the end, she had done the one thing none of them had prepared for: she had vanished in a way that rendered their violence meaningless. The note in his pocket was addressed to him. I will not take another name. Not his. Not theirs. She had decided who she was and who she would never become. Pelletier left Point Verdun the following year. Census records show him as an unmarried bookkeeper in Mobile, Alabama. He never married. He died of tuberculosis in 1897 in a charity hospital and was buried in a pauper's section of a Catholic cemetery. The note with the 3 initials was never found among his effects. Deline Basau lived. She spent 6 years in Cincinnati under her borrowed name, teaching French to the daughters of river merchants, living quietly in a Quaker widow's house, attending a small Episcopal church. She understood her new papers would not survive close Catholic scrutiny. She sent money anonymously through Marshall Callahan to Marcus Freeman's widow, Cora, for 11 years. She moved to Boston in 1877, worked as a copy editor, then settled in a small town in western Massachusetts where she taught French at a girls' school for nearly 30 years. She never married. She wore a thin silver chain with a small oval locket around her neck for the rest of her life. When she died in 1928 at the age of 81, the headmistress opened the locket. Inside was a folded piece of paper with 3 faded initials. She never returned to Louisiana. She never spoke of Point Verdun. But she subscribed to a New Orleans newspaper for 46 years and read it every evening by the window, pencil in hand, chicory coffee beside her. What she marked, no one ever asked. She died under a borrowed name and was buried in a New England churchyard with a false birth date on the stone. The only document she ever signed with her true name after that night was the letter in the attic trunk. She had chosen neither the death they planned nor the false life they offered. She chose a third path, to become, in the records of Point Verdun, a woman who had vanished, while continuing to live fully in her own story. The ledger and the letter now rest in a glass case at Tulane University archives. They are rarely consulted, perhaps 3 times a year, by graduate students writing dissertations on Reconstruction violence. They note the curious case of a witness whose disappearance was staged so perfectly that her body was never found. But this is more than a mystery. It is a testimony. It reveals that history is not only what was done, but what was silenced and what refused to be silenced. Deline understood that the system's greatest weapon against women like her was not violence, but erasure. Her revenge was to survive and leave a record. She understood, with the weightless clarity that comes only to those who have stared sin in the face, that some ledgers must be preserved for divine accounting even if earthly courts fail. Like Judith, she struck not with steel but with truth and cunning. She turned their own patience and administrative evil against them. The system that waited in that parlor in 1871 still exists in different forms today: patient, efficient, skilled at making inconvenient people and truths disappear. But so does the quiet resistance of those who choose to leave a record. Deline Basau did not defeat the system. But she refused to let it write the final sentence about her life. Marcus Freeman's body was never recovered. His widow Cora raised their children alone, took in washing, and moved to New Orleans. On her deathbed in 1902, she told her daughter she hoped somewhere a record still existed, that someone would find it. Edward Lomé survived but broken, beaten into silence, selling penny candy from a tray until his death in 1889. Judge Tremont was quietly transferred. The young planter became a state senator, remembered with a bronze plaque that calls him a man of honor and discretion. His family still lives in Point Verdun. Marshall Callahan retired to Massachusetts and died in 1891. Among his effects was a locked wooden box of letters from a woman who signed herself with only a single initial. The letters have since disappeared. What do you think happened in that locked room on the night of July 4, 1871? Do you believe Deline chose the only path a woman in her position could have chosen? Or was there another way? When Etienne Pelletier sat alone in that empty room with her note in his pocket, do you think he finally understood what he had lost? Or do men like him only feel the weight years later, if ever? Should Marcus Freeman's name be on a plaque in that courthouse instead of the senator's? Leave your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter. They keep the lamp burning on stories that powerful men tried to bury. If this story moved you, if it chilled you or gave you courage, share it with someone who seeks truth in dark places. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. There are other ledgers in other parishes. Other locked rooms. Other women and men who chose to leave a record.
we are only beginning to open them. I'll see you in the next one.